Welcome to this session of our Fall 2021 workshop series. Today's discussion will focus on how entrepreneurs can become more bankable post-COVID. My name is Michelle Chen, and I am the founder of the Axiom Advancement Corporation. We are a financial institution with a mission to provide access to capital and business development support for small businesses, especially those located in economically disadvantaged communities. We are intentional in our approach to support minority, women-owned, and disadvantaged business enterprises. And today, our guest is Ben Contrucci, the CFO of SSB Bank in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ben's banking career spans well over a decade, and his passion for community lending has also been a driving force in the work that he does. We are also fortunate to have Ben serve on the Axiom's executive board. Ben, thank you so much for being here today. We're looking forward to everything that you have to tell us, and we know it's going to be good. So can you just take a moment and give us a little bit of your background? Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I started in banking about 17 years ago. I actually converted from high school mathematics. So I was a high school mathematics teacher for about 3 years before converting into banking. The reason for my switch was for income purposes, but I found that my background in mathematics and financial modeling in the banking field allowed me to reach people on a much grander scale than I was in teaching, and it also served my needs as well. So it was a good transition for me. I was in lending for probably the better part of a decade, so that was where I learned most of my banking skills was in the lending field, but now I've transitioned into the CFO role, which is a little more tied to the mathematics background that I have. So I'm right where I'm meant to be. I love my job. I love the institution I work for, and I love being part of Axiom and our relationship with Axiom as well, because that also allows the bank to reach a great deal of folks that we wouldn't otherwise be able to in the normal course of business.
And I can tell you that SSB has been an incredible partner, not just because Ben serves on the executive board, but also because we have formed a partnership that, especially during COVID, has proven to be really beneficial to the customers that we serve. And we can get a little bit into that. We received a lot of inquiries when the CARES Act was launched, and we were able to refer all of those people. I don't remember how many, but we were able to refer a lot to SSB, and we were absolutely confident that they were going to receive the hand-holding that they needed during that time. SSB took excellent care of them, and many of you who are watching, I'm sure you know how well they took care of even non-customers during that time. So can you just share with us what SSB Bank has done during the COVID era, and even with regards to the CARES Act?
Sure. There's really two ways in which the CARES Act affected our institution. And number one, you already mentioned, was the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP loans. So we, as an institution, originated over $40 million in PPP loans. These were the loans that went to employers so that they could make payroll over the pandemic period. So for a $250 million bank, $40 million in loans over that period is quite a great deal. And that would be quite a bit more lending that we've ever done in that period of time. So that was one way, and we were able to reach several thousand employees throughout that period and ensure that they continued to get paychecks. So that was that was one way of helping. And a lot of those folks were referred from Axiom and Michelle. So thank you for that. You know, we love bringing on new customers. So one of the interesting things about the pandemic period was that some of the larger institutions in this area, like PNC, that have larger market shares, were, you know, when this all happened, it was like them drinking out of a fire hose, trying to take on these PPP applications. So as a smaller institution, we were happy to serve those customers that some of the other institutions were not able to. A lot of them put stipulations into place that you had to be a current customer. We did not. We diverted staff from other areas of the bank into the lending area so that we could take on as many new people as possible. So that was one way of doing it. The other way that we were able to help the community in this period was through forbearance, loan forbearance. So our existing loan portfolio, which is both business and residential consumers, if they were unable to make payments during that period, we were able to put them into a state of forbearance, which means that they didn't have to make payments during that period, but the payments that would have been made just got moved to the end of the loan. So they will make them eventually, but it gave those borrowers a great deal of relief in a time that was needed.
So Ben, about how long was that period?
Well, that period started in March of 2020, and for a lot of businesses, it lasted 2 or 3 months, that forbearance period. But for some businesses, it continues to this day. It really depends on what sector of the economy you're in. You know, if you own a restaurant downtown, you're still not operating at full capacity. You're still not bringing in the revenue that you need to fully operate. So, but if you own an online business, you know, you could be thriving right now. So, depending on the sector that you're in and how you operate, really determine how long that would last.
And we definitely know it was industry specific, you know, as far as whether you were flailing or you were actually, you know, increasing those profits and revenues. So we're so fortunate that you took care of our customers and also non-customers. And so I wanted to also ask you to just kind of give us an update of where the banks are now post-COVID. Not that COVID has gone away, but we're getting our footing and it's starting to feel a little bit more normal.
Absolutely. So post-COVID, most banks find themselves in a position where they have a great deal of liquidity. Banks have not done a great deal of lending outside of PPP and mortgage lending over the past 18 months. So your traditional business lending, there hasn't been a great deal of that type of activity over this time. So there's banks find themselves with a great deal of cash that they've been sitting on waiting to deploy. So I think banks are primed and ready to lend. Of course, it needs to be done in a safe and sound manner, in a responsible manner. And the health of the economy is probably the biggest driver in that. So as the economy improves and it becomes safe to lend out money, safer to lend out money, you'll see a lot of that activity come back.
Wonderful. So that's good news. Would you say the banks are leaning towards being more conservative, or?
Banks are always going to lean to be more conservative. Banks are by the nature of what we do, we're generally not pioneers. We're generally not risk takers. We're generally banks are going to do things that they know work and that they've seen work in other places and that they've had work for themselves. So they're usually the last group to dip their toe into the pool, if you will. But like I said, as the economy improves, the banks will follow. They will have to follow.
Wonderful. And today's presentation is basically going to give you the information that you need so that you can take advantage of all the liquidity that Ben just mentioned. And so I'll leave it to you, Ben, for your presentation, and I'll be back.
And this is my presentation, Becoming Bankable Post-COVID. And this is just my contact information. So again, Michelle mentioned I'm the Chief Financial Officer at SSB Bank. My email address is there if anybody has the need to reach out with questions or comments. I'm very open to that. And I wanted to start just by going over very briefly the effects of COVID-19 on the banking industry. Obviously, when people stop working and the economy comes to a halt, loan payments stop coming in, right? So high loan default was one of the first things that started to happen under COVID. Now, if you do some research, you won't see that. You won't find that anywhere because of the forbearance program that the CARES Act allowed banks to do. Is they could put these customers onto the forbearance program and not report them as delinquent or defaulted loans. So there was high loan default, only it was just under the surface. We already mentioned high liquidity. Banks had a lot of staffing difficulties. So number one, if you're looking for new people, if you're looking to hire new people during this period, it was very, very difficult. Anybody in your positions as business owners, if you've been looking to hire somebody over the last 18 months, I'm sure you've found the same difficulties that we're all running into. There's not a lot of candidates out there, and furthermore, most folks want to work from home right now. So staffing up has been very difficult. And then lastly, we talked about commercial loan production has been low outside of PPP lending. So banks are primed and ready to revive that. Coming out of COVID, business lending will come back. That I can promise you. But what will banks be looking for when it comes to small business lending? This is really the substance of what I wanted to talk about today. Is what criteria are they looking to see when they're making approvals or making these loan decisions? And the first one is not going to be a surprise to anybody, but credit history is still going to be a big part of this process. And I'm talking about the credit reports of the principal owners here. So I want to differentiate between the credit of the business and the credit of the individuals or the principals who own that business. When we're talking about very small business, generally it's the credit report or the credit history of the principal owners that the banks are going to be concerned with. They're dealing with these people, right? So number one, making sure that you have your credit in line, you've got your payment history, you're not making late payments, that you want to make sure that you've got a good history of payments made on time. That's going to be number one. The score itself, maybe not quite as important as the information that's on the report. So you want to remember that. You want to document all of the outgoing payments that you make. When you pay utilities, leases, you make a payment to a vendor, you want to make sure you save receipts, invoices. You want to be able to prove that you're making payments and just as importantly, you're making them on time. Another thing that's important to the bank is the repayment history with the bank. Obviously, if you have a clean repayment history with a bank, they're going to be more likely to continue to lend to you in the future than if you don't. Now, what if you have issues with any of these things? What if you have a low credit score or you have a bad credit history? What we would typically do is refer you to a credit counseling company or a credit repair company and let you work directly with them for however long it takes for you to correct whatever issues were there. And then we will welcome you to make another application as soon as that's corrected. But that's the typical process, is if there are credit issues that we would refer you to one of our partners that can help you solve those issues. And Axiom has many resources to make that connection. Let's go to the next component, which is cash flow. So this is how a loan is repaid. The loan is repaid using cash. So how can you prove that you're going to have the cash to continue to make payments? Well, documenting that is usually done with tax returns or financial statements from your accountant, or if you don't have any of those things, the next option would be to make a projection or a pro forma. So some banks will absolutely insist that you have to have 3 years of tax returns, and we're going to average the income from those tax returns to figure out how much you have to make payments. Other banks will allow you to make a projection and say, this is what I project going forward to be bringing in as revenue. Here are my projected expenses. And, the result is that I'll be able to make this loan payment. Of course, if you're going to make a projection, you want to use very reasonable, conservative numbers that can be backed up with data, because the bank will likely ask you where those numbers came from or how you supported them. But that's always an option, is to make that projection. If the bank you're dealing with won't allow that, and you don't have the history, my suggestion would be to look around for another institution that will accept the projections. Let's go to the next slide. Collateral. So banks like to have collateral for loans. It makes the loan a little bit more approvable because it's a secondary source of repayment. What does that mean? Well, the primary source of repayment is from cash flow, from just the business operation, making cash and paying the loan. If the business is unable to make the payments using cash flow, the next source of repayment is the collateral, the liquidation of collateral. And again, that's always a last resort. So it makes the loan a little less risky to the bank to have collateral, but as a small business owner, oftentimes that's not an option. Oftentimes business owners don't have real estate or expensive equipment or other things that they can use to collateralize that loan. In those cases, you can apply for an unsecured loan. What are the consequences of applying for an unsecured loan? Oftentimes, it's going to be a little bit higher of a rate and a little bit unfavorable loan terms as compared to the collateralized loan. But the option is there for you, and it's a viable option if you need to take that route. Another thing that a lot of small business owners may have the option of doing would be to use accounts receivable as collateral as well. So that's another thing that a lot of folks don't think of as an asset that's able to be collateralized, but accounts receivable is able to be collateralized. So that's another option. Aside from collateral, banks want to know that you have a plan for the money. What are you going to do with the money? You want to be as specific as possible when you're communicating this to the bank. So if you're applying for a loan, you want to be able to determine what that loan is for. Is it to buy a book of business? Is it to buy a piece of equipment, a vehicle? Maybe it's to build out your space that you're renting, or maybe it's to buy a building. Okay, but any of those things, you want to have the purpose for that money as stated as clearly as possible, and you want to stick to that purpose. And then the last thing, and what I feel is the most relevant component to evaluating a loan, is the borrower personally monetarily invested? What does that mean? Well, personally invested we know what that means, but monetarily meaning that the borrower has skin in the game. They've contributed some of their own funds into this project or whatever it may be. So if you're buying a piece of equipment, or you're buying a piece of real estate, or you're purchasing anything, the bank wants to see that the borrower is contributing some of their own funds to that. Why is that? Well, if you have no skin in the game, people are much more likely to walk away from a business that may be going down the wrong path. If the business starts to fail and you have no skin in the game, it's very easy to walk away. But if you've made a significant investment of your own money into that situation, you're involved, you're invested, and you're not going to walk away. You're going to do everything that you can to make that work. So having that, personal investment gives the bank a great sense of security that, hey, we have a true partner here that is going to do everything they can to make this work. And ultimately, that's what the bank wants. They want to be repaid, and they want the business to succeed, because that means the loan gets repaid and everybody wins in that case. So being personally invested is number one in my book. And if you look at the data, it is actually the strongest correlation to loan repayment. When the borrower has their own money invested, they will find a way to repay that loan. So that's a nutshell of what banks will be looking for coming out of COVID. And a lot of that is the same stuff, but COVID has presented some challenges to a lot of these things that may not have existed in prior times. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to mention about cash flow post-COVID is that banks generally are going to ask you for your tax returns for the past couple of years. And when you provide them your tax returns, including your 2020 tax returns, that 2020 tax return for a lot of businesses may not look very healthy, in the sense that you didn't make a lot of money in 2020. Depending on the business or the sector that you were in, 2020 could have been a very bad year for you. So when the underwriter looks at that 2020 tax return, how are they going to treat it? Some banks may look at that and say, well, the numbers are what they are, and we're going to use this as a projection moving forward, which is probably not a very good projection, considering 2020 would have been a much different year, we hope, than what the future will hold. But other banks may treat that differently. Other banks may disregard the year altogether, or backfill it in with other information. So as a borrower, when you're making an application, if you are of the business type that may have had a very dismal income year in 2020, that would be a good upfront question to ask the loan officer, is how are you going to treat my 2020 tax returns? Because they don't look like what I'm expecting 2021 or 22 or 23 to look like. So again, that's just a tip to try and get out in front of that question, so you're not wasting your time with somebody who's going to look at 2020 and use that as a projection moving forward. Okay, now I'm going to go back to, I just finished monetarily invested, and I'm going to start on documentation. So this last slide is just offers some tips as to the documentation that you always want to have available at your fingertips. This is just a handful of things. This is not a complete list. Some of you may have some things that you've been asked for in the past by banks that is not on this list, so you may want to add to this list. But nonetheless, if you have an LLC or a corporation, you should have articles of incorporation, which is your document that shows the filing with the state. So most of you are probably incorporated in the state of Pennsylvania, but it may be another state. If that's the case, you want to make sure that you always have your articles of incorporation on hand. You want to have an operating agreement, especially if you have a business partner. The operating agreement is the governing document for your company. So if you're a one-person operation, maybe that's not quite as important. But if you have a business partner, this is the document that draws those boundaries between you and your business partner. It assigns, assigns responsibilities and duties, and it also outlines what you can and can't do. So it's a great way to set boundaries with your business partner, and it's a very necessary thing to make a successful business. You want to make sure you have your tax ID documented from the IRS. So when you apply for that, they send you a document stating that. You want to always have that. You want to have a fresh personal financial statement at your fingertips. Banks are always going to ask for this when you apply for a loan. Personal and business tax returns, that probably went without saying. You always want to have those handy. They're going to be part of your loan application anytime you apply. And then any necessary business license or certification. You want to have all this stuff on a flash drive or saved in a file on your computer somewhere where you can get to it quickly and send that over to a bank, because all of these things are going to be part of a loan application. So if you just always have them with you, it makes that paperwork process that much easier. And that concludes my presentation.
Basically, you have given us a whole laundry list of things that we can do to prepare for coming to your bank and any local bank for that matter. I wanted to just go back to, can you speak on how your business bank account plays a role in this? For a lot of entrepreneurs, especially at the startup stage, they're not quite sure what the banks are looking for when they look to see, your purchases, things like that. And I think sometimes there's a mixture, business expenses and personal expenses, and how does that fare when they submit those, along with the application?
So I'm going to take a step back. Are you asking in relation to applying for a loan?
Yes. Do you look at the bank statements or anything like that? Do you guys look at that?
Yeah. So typically bank statements are reviewed, but when applying for a commercial loan, it's probably not one of the pieces that are that important to the underwriter, because what the underwriter is really looking for is revenue and expenses, business expenses, and they're going to find those on the tax return.
Okay.
So bank statements would only be used for that purpose if tax returns weren't available. So if we're in October of 2021, if you haven't completed your 2020 taxes yet, yeah, that might be used to figure out what 2020 looked like.
It's still worth mentioning. So especially because of 2020. So let's cut there and just add that. And I'm trying to think of where to add it, but to say what, how it can be used.
So that would be in the cash flow section.
Okay. And go.
Okay, so another thing that can help document cash flow would be bank statements. So if we're in a period where you possibly didn't have your tax returns completed yet. So let's say that it's March of 2021 and you haven't completed your 2020 tax returns yet, but you're applying for a loan. The bank some banks will use bank statements to see what the revenue is being brought in and the expenses going out over that time period. So that's another way of documenting cash flow if needed.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. You also mentioned having a fresh financial statement. And when you say fresh, what time frame are you speaking of?
Um, I update mine quarterly.
Okay, that was my question. Is
Yeah.
it quarterly or is it monthly?
Well, it depends on how much time you have. My answer to that would be quarterly would generally be sufficient, but I would give it a quick updating. If you're making a loan application, I would update it right before that loan application. But that should be easy if you're keeping up with it quarterly.
Wonderful. So Ben, thank you so much for all of this information. I know it's going to prove to be so valuable as our loan customers and grantees and all of those who are viewing this workshop session today. And if you have any questions, again, Ben is available. You can also reach out to us. You can find us at www.axiompgh.com. We have all of that information. There's always a box on there that says get in contact, reach out to us, and we can get you connected to Ben. Now, this is the first of many conversations, and so we look forward to having Ben in our future workshop series. And thank you all again for attending, and have a wonderful day.